Susan. I'm here because Roe v. Wade saved my life in 1971 and 1973 and made it possible for me to support myself, get a college education, and raise a family, which I never could have done ever if I had not had the ability to make my own decisions. People that don't know what they're talking about really do not know what they're talking about. People died, and I'm not talking about embryos. I'm talking.
So that video was taken at one of the various events of the reproductive rights movement, or as some may know it plainly as the pro-choice movement. This topic has garnered serious discussion on both sides of the spectrum, and while this movement is focused on securing various reproductive rights, the main thing to know is it's centered around the belief that every individual should have the legal right to an abortion. This presentation will look at the history of the movement and the various characteristics that are attached to it, and we'll go ahead and we'll start by looking at the history of this movement that started in the 70s.
Thanks, Travis. So I'm going to provide you guys with some background information so that you can understand what was happening at the beginning of the movement, why it developed, and what it was forming in response to. So in 1973, Roe v. Wade challenged a Texas law that prohibited all but life-saving abortions. The Supreme Court decided that the law was invalid on the grounds that the constitutional right to privacy also included a person's decision on whether to terminate their pregnancy. Although Roe v. Wade was a big win, there were other court cases that unfortunately further harmed healthcare for pregnant people. In 1980, the Supreme Court rejected a challenge to the Hyde Amendment. Although the lawsuit challenging the federal ban was unsuccessful, the ACLU and its allies did succeed in the following years in overturning many state funding bans. Later, in 1990, the ACLU secured the option for teenagers of going to court to get an authorization for an abortion in case their parents or their guardians did not give them permission to do so. This case was a challenge to a state law that required a minor to notify both biological parents before having an abortion. Then, in 1992, the Supreme Court ended up still preserving constitutional protection for a person's right to choose to have an abortion, but it unfortunately adopted a new and weaker test for evaluating restrictive abortion laws, making it easier for state abortion regulations to survive constitutional review. And last but not least, in 2001, the court held that the Fourth Amendment does not permit the state acting without either a warrant or individualized suspicion to drug test people who seek prenatal care at a public hospital. Further, the court insisted on the importance of confidentiality in the medical context.
Thanks, Maddie. So since this movement is not a recent one, it has plenty of socio-cultural and political context to unpack. It is important to note that the reproductive rights movement was also prevalent during the times of second wave feminism and its call for reproductive autonomy, the sexual revolution combined with the 1960s youth rebellion, the civil rights movement and families' increased need for double income, lack of adequate daycare for children, and alarms over surging world population, medical technology advances, and lastly, higher education spread of women's studies programs and research. All of these important examples heavily contributed to the context surrounding the salience of reproductive rights and the vital need for a movement to occur during those different time periods. When analyzing the reproductive rights movement and the many campaigns that fall beneath it, it is essential to evaluate the environment and background of that movement.
Paris, so although each demographic has faced the effects that abortion bans have, two main social groups have faced the brunt of the repercussions that these abortion bans have on them. And the first group that we take a look at is lower class people. Now, the ultimate goal that is contained within the reproductive rights movement has been to ensure that each individual has the right to obtain an abortion. However, as history has shown, as the trends have played out, and as the current fight is being portrayed, it now shows that those who only have money can participate in that fight. So essentially, income and assets have determined that ability to fight to control reproduction. This obviously creates a severe disadvantage as they can't even fight for the rights for these reproductive rights, let alone get the rights. This leads them to being more vulnerable and susceptible to conservative attacks, as those with money are left virtually unaffected, and it creates this never-ending cycle. The next group that is affected by these abortion bans is people of color. Now, the unfortunate reality is some people are placed in these both groups, so essentially their financial gateways are further limited. And this is evidenced by the Hyde Amendment, as after Roe v. Wade in 1976, Congress passed this amendment that banned federal Medicaid funding for abortions. Several states followed suit, and poor people, and more importantly, disproportionately people of color, saw their rights evaporate. This created an issue with current organizations at that time who had the decision to make to either fight for all rights or fight for some rights. This led people of color forming new organizations to fight these population control politics.
Okay, so now that we have covered the background of and the people affected by the reproductive rights movement, it is important to identify and assess the main goals of this movement. First, let's start off by reading a quote that sums up the overarching goal of the movement. The pro choice movement contends that people have a constitutionally protected right to abortion and work to keep abortion safe and legal. Additionally, here are some other major goals that fall under this movement. The first one is advocating a broader reproductive rights, health, and justice agenda. These activists want to create a more open and accessible world, and a big step starts with reproductive rights. The next goal is to allow for pregnant people to have control over their own bodies. By not allowing, we are ripping away a pregnant person's ability to make the best choice for them. Next, it is important to protect reproductive freedom and the right to have an abortion. Although this is similar to the one stated above, it really emphasizes the significance of bodily autonomy. The following goal is to create access to abortion and healthcare. By taking away Planned Parenthood and other establishments like that, we are also taking away a whole institution that has changed and saved many lives, like we saw in the video in the beginning. This also relates to protecting the providers and the clinics. Additionally, we need to prevent the recriminalization of abortion. Although abortion still has a massive stigma surrounding it, we need to prevent it from being criminalized. And lastly, it is important for activists to overcome legal challenges to Roe v. Wade that are still extremely relevant in society today.
Thanks, Paris. So she just told us about the main goals of the movement, and now I'm going to talk about some of the key features, a few of the organizations, and some of the activists who are currently involved in the movement. So overall, we agreed that the main feature of this movement is to allow for people to have control over their own bodies, specifically their right to have an abortion, along with the movement at large protecting people's rights to abortions, advocating for abortion healthcare and healthcare for pregnant people, as well as reducing the stigma for having an abortion. I'm also going to talk about 3 different organizations that are very involved in the movement. The first one is NARA Pro-Choice America. They are active in fighting to keep abortion legal for all people, regardless of their zip code or their income. The next is the Center for Reproductive Rights, which is currently the only global legal advocacy organization for reproductive rights. They have participated in every major U.S. Supreme Court abortion-based case since our founding and strengthened reproductive laws and policies in more than 60 countries across 5 continents. And then last up is Planned Parenthood. They're a nonprofit organization that provides reproductive health care in the United States and globally. They provide patients with comprehensive sex and reproductive education, emergency contraception, abortion services and referrals, birth control, and a bunch of other necessary services. So now I'm going to talk about some of the activists that are active within the movement. The first one up is Brittany Mollister, who is currently the executive director at the Chicago Abortion Fund. Through her assistance from this fund, she had the financial support she needed to make her own choice about getting an abortion, and now shares her experience across multiple platforms with the hope of destigmatizing abortion, especially among people of color. Next up is Jennifer Weiss-Wolf, who is currently the vice president for the development at the Brennan Center for Justice, which is an advocacy group that fights in courts and works with elected officials to advance legislation. She has written articles for publications ranging from Upworthy to the New York Times, all focusing on menstruation justice and equality, especially for low-income and incarcerated people. And last but not least, we have Maddie Rasmussen, who completed a high school senior project in 2017 called the Safe Place Project. It's a website that provides both an interactive map and a list of abortion providers by state, and it also includes information on abortion restrictions such as waiting periods and required counseling on a state-by-state basis. Maddie started this project when she became an intern at Legal Voice during her junior year, which is a women's advocacy group in downtown Seattle.
So the particular event within this movement that we're looking at is called the Stop the Bans protest, which happened on May 21st, 2019. And it was organized by the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Action Fund, and Narrow Pro-Choice America. And the reason, overall, there are 50 organizations who participated in it as well. And the reason all these organizations came together, it was in response to a flood of severely restrictive abortion laws that were being passed at the time. And this campaign took place across the country in almost all 50 states. There were more than 400 presentations being held at state houses and courthouses and town squares. And the significance of this event is that it showed mass collaboration on a scale that had yet to be seen before within this movement. The campaign was organized nationwide and brought together so many people that it was able to sway the public opinion on abortion. And overall, it established the direction of the greater social movement. The actual law that kickstarted the Stop the Bans protest was passed in Alabama May 2019. It was called the Life Protection Act, and it was the harshest measure of abortion that had been passed yet. And this had restrictions on abortion with no exceptions for cases of rape or incest. And many states followed shortly after, including Alabama, Georgia, Missouri, Ohio, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, all with very similar laws, many of which revolved around heartbeat bills, which restrict abortions after the first heartbeat was detected, which occurs around 6 weeks when many people don't even know that they're pregnant yet. They also created felony charges for performing an abortion with consequences up to 99 years in jail, and overall creating certain week periods where you could not get an abortion afterwards, often of which were unreasonable. And overall, 28 states introduced legislation on abortion bans in the first quarter of 2019 alone. So many rhetorical strategies and tactics were used at this event. One of the most noticeable ones was probably slogans, as you could hear protesters chant and have signs that said, "My body, my choice," and "Abortion is healthcare." And this was extremely powerful because it represented bodily autonomy. And at the same time, it was very catchy, very easy to remember. And that way it was able to spread on social media and be used by popular figures and reach a wide audience. Next, labeling was used, which used namings to create certain associations, such as in the name itself, Stop the Bans. It created a negative association with bans and therefore a positive association with bodily autonomy, as well as aligning it as being a pro-choice movement. It implies that if you're not with this movement, you're actually anti-choice. Next is framing, which constructed a particular point of view, and this protest was able to do this by putting the spotlight on politicians and addressing and blaming politicians for the legislation that they had been putting forward, as well as providing solutions which were to lift the bans. Next, there were tailoring shared experiences at this event, which was very important because it created a lot of solidarity as people came together and disclosed their stories and disclosed their narratives and help other people understand what the experience was like if they had never been in that situation themselves. And overall, it helped reduce the stigma around abortion and just created a lot of identification. Lastly, vilification was used, and the purpose of vilification is to show that the opposing movement isn't a matter of having a different opinion, but rather they're coming from a place that's ungenuine and even malevolent. For example, the pro-choice movement is able to do that during these protests by calling attention to the hypocrisy of the pro-life movement. They'll hold signs or say things such as, "If you're pro-life, why don't you care about the maternal mortality rate of Black people, which is significantly higher than other ethnicities," and also called attention to the fact that even though the pro-life movement says their values is about upholding the sanctity of life, this movement is arguing that no, it's an oppressive movement that attacks reproductive rights.
So has Stop the Bans changed public opinion? So although the true effect of these events have yet to be seen, in the short term, the answer is yes. Due to nationwide organization involving various pro-choice organizations, endorsement from celebrities and politicians, as well as general engagement and publicity that this event generated, yes, public opinion has changed. And this is evidenced from the first major piece of legislature that was introduced, being the Equal Access to Abortion Coverage and Health Insurance Act, or as it's known plainly as the EACH Act. This bill was a federal bill to ensure that every person who receives healthcare or insurance through the federal government would have coverage for abortion care. And this reversed the Hyde Amendment and other bans that targeted the two main social groups that were affected by these bans, that being lower class people and people of color. Furthermore, one of the groups that is most opposed to abortion, that being US Catholics, have now experienced a switch and are now generally more supportive of various reproductive rights. That being said, 56% of Catholics have now said that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, with only 4 in 10 or 42% saying that it should be illegal in all or most cases. When you combine this with other various groups that are in generally full support of abortion and other reproductive rights, it is evidence that the tides may have shifted and momentum could be generated for the fight for reproductive rights.
Thank you for watching our presentation. I know some of the information we threw at you all today is depressing, but we believe that learning about this movement and the Stop the Bans protest is seriously important, whether or not you yourself have a vagina. Abortion is still technically legal in all 50 states, but statewide abortion bans are still causing undue harm towards pregnant people. Abortion bans are dangerous and do not consider the life of a pregnant person over the zygote, embryo, or fetus inside of them. While we do believe that public opinion is starting to change and that things are getting better, we need to remember that statewide abortion bans of any kind are just as insidious as making abortion illegal. We also need to remember that banning abortions in any capacity will not stop people from getting abortions. These abortion bans will force more people to take matters into their own hands and use unsafe methods that could seriously harm them, resulting in failed abortion attempts, mutilation, severe injury, or in worst cases, death. We also need to remember that abortions are a necessary part of healthcare, and the choice to get one must be protected at all costs. And lastly, regardless of how you personally feel about abortion, it's their body, it's their choice.
Lastly, we have provided 3 discussion questions and 1 optional question to allow our audience to apply their knowledge to not only the questions proposed, but to their everyday lives and personal perspectives. The first one is, what more do you think can/should be done in order to protect people's reproductive rights? The next, why do you think so many people in this country are anti-abortion/pro-life? What more can we do to help them understand that reproductive rights are necessary and are not an attack on their personal beliefs? The third one is, do you think that the country's ideas and feelings about abortions is changing? Why or why not? And the optional question is, if you know anyone who believes abortion should be illegal in all/most/some cases, would you take the time to talk to them about it? If so, how would you talk to them about it? And if you choose not to, what is stopping you? Thanks for watching our presentation.